it's an agency, board, or commission, and they explain how that body intends to carry out or administer a federal law. In this presentation, I'll be talking about rules and regulations interchangeably. I don't want this to throw you off. I'm using them as synonyms, and I'm not drawing a difference between them. So regulation equals rule, rule equals regulation for purposes of federal regulations in this presentation. All right, so let's get started. I always like to start webinars by giving everyone a roadmap of where we're going during a presentation. So first, I'm going to give you a very basic overview of the regulatory process. How are federal executive branch bodies such as agencies, boards, or commissions able to make law via regulations? And what processes do they have to follow to do so? Next, I'm going to talk about the steps involved in promulgating a rule, particularly what needs to be published in the two main federal publications regarding regulations, the Federal Register and the Code of Federal Regulations, and what order this publication process must follow. And then finally, the bulk of this presentation is going to be in figuring out how to trace a regulation from its final form in the U.S. Code of Federal Regulations back to its formative processes in the Federal Register, and then finally back to its agency docket. The docket is going to be the place that contains all the files related to the creation and promulgation of a rule. And if you haven't heard those terms before, don't worry. We're going to go much more in depth as we go through this presentation. All right, so what can administrative bodies do? Because Congress can't be an expert on all the details of everything, it will often pass a statute that provides a general directive, so like the broad strokes, and then it grants an administrative body or agency the regulatory authority to issue detailed rules and regulations based on that law. There's largely two reasons that Congress does this. An agency has a particular subject matter expertise on a topic or an issue addressed by that statute. Like, for example, the Department of Labor would be expected to have extensive knowledge about labor and employment issues, so they'd be the one to promulgate rules in that area. Or Congress wants to provide a mechanism for the law to more easily adapt and respond to change. Sometimes federal regulations can be updated more quickly than federal statutes, so the laws passed by Congress. But despite these positives, Congress realized that agencies were not headed by elected officials, and that the regulatory process was pretty opaque and not very uniform. So they passed the Administrative Procedure Act in 1946. And as you can see there, I've listed the goals. The goals of the APA were to require increased openness about agency organization and procedures, to allow for increased public participation. That's going to be a big one we're going to talk about today, and to ensure that agency procedures follow uniform standards. So let's talk about some of these processes. Agency rules and regulations carry the force of law as long as they follow the standards laid out by statutes. So one of these standards is going to be laid out in the APA, so the processes you have to follow due to the APA. There's a few types of rules that are actually exempted from the APA, particularly, and you see them listed there, rules regarding kind of the interpretation of regulatory language or the kind of basic procedural processes of regulations put out by an agency, policy statements put out by an agency, and as you can probably guess, rules related to a military or foreign affairs function, so things that have to be a little bit more secretive for the public interest. But almost all other rulemaking processes are going to fall under the notice and comment rulemaking process. You might have also seen this referred to as the informal rulemaking process, and I'm going to use those interchangeably as well. This process is covered by the APA, and that's what we're going to focus on today because that's largely what you're going to see when you do your research. All right, so you can see there's a stepwise process in the notice and comment rulemaking process. So the first step of this process actually isn't on this form. I want to talk a little bit about what agencies do every year. They do something called the regulatory plan. They put out a notice about the slate of rules they're planning on proposing in the coming year. They publish it in something called the regulatory plan. Once a year, the regulatory plan is combined with something called the unified agenda. So if you guys have ever seen reference to the Unified Agenda, that details that comes out about twice a year, and that details agencies' current regulatory and deregulatory activities. So the agencies are required to give this kind of notice on what they plan to do in the coming year and then what they are doing about halfway through the year. The Unified Agenda is put out by the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs, also known as OIRA, in the Office of Management and Budget, known as OMB. So I know there's going to be a lot of things like this where you have to focus on the different, you know, OIRA and OMB. I don't want you to get bogged down in that. What I want you to know is these things are required to be published. They give you a heads up about what's coming in the next year. Then the agency goes to work on actually drafting that proposed rule, and they put it out in the Federal Register, and it's called a Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or NPRM. The NPRM is published in the Federal Register, and it typically involves asking for public comment. So members of the public are actually given a certain number of days in which to respond to that NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking. Typically, this period is about 30 to 90 days. There's no hard and fast rule about that, and it can be extended by a notice later on. So if they get a lot of feedback, they can actually expand that date range. All right, after that, the agency is required to take public comments into account, and then they draft a final rule. That final rule is also published in the Federal Register, and it gives a general statement of basis and purpose, and it is required to address public comments. Now, it's not required to go through each public comment and say, you know, Jane Doe said this thing and this is how we're reacting. They can group together kind of topics that were talked about in the public comments and talk about how they address those comments. All right, all the creations, amendments, etc., made by that final rule are then incorporated into the Code of Federal Regulations. We're going to go really in depth on the Code of Federal Regulations in just a moment. But before we go on, I want you to note I put a couple asterisks there. And you'll see at the bottom, it might be a little unclear. Don't worry, we can send you the slides. In fact, I'm going to leave some time at the end to send you the slides. But if a final rule is considered a significant regulatory action under Executive Order 12866, it must be reviewed by OIRA. Remember I talked about OIRA putting out the Unified Agenda? OIRA has to review it before it can be published. Now, this is not every rule. Significant regulatory actions there could be a whole class on just that, but largely it refers to regulations that have over $100 million effect on the economy. So we largely don't have to deal with that, but every once in a while when you have a very big piece of rulemaking, it will have to go through OIRA first, both at the proposed rule step and at the final rule step. As you can see from the chart, publication is a critical part of the informal or notice and comment rulemaking process. You might have also noticed there are two major publications in this process. I mentioned them a couple times already. We're going to get really in-depth on them in just a second, but I wanted to explain the main differences between them before we go forward, because I think it makes a little more sense if we just briefly talk about it. The Federal Register is where you're going to find proposed rules, any notices like those changing a comment period, and final rules. It's published almost every business day, and it's set up chronologically without any sense of, you know, what topics are being considered, what agencies are promulgating the rules, etc. It's just literally these agencies put out these notices or proposed rules or final rules on this day. In contrast, the Code of Federal Regulations, or you'll sometimes hear us refer to it as the CFR, is the collection of all the regulations currently in effect at the time of publication. So think of it as a snapshot of all the federal regulations we have to follow in the U.S. at a certain period of time, with all the deletions and additions and amendments made by final rules up to that point included. So instead of being laid out chronologically, it's laid out by subject. I'm going to dig into the structure of the CFR a little more in just a moment, but first I want to talk about tracing federal regulations. What steps should we take to complete our regulations research? Particularly when I talk about tracing, I'm saying, how do we take a regulation in its final form in the CFR, trace it back to the proposed rulemaking in the Federal Register, and then take the information we find from that proposed rulemaking to get us back to the agency docket, or the collection of documents produced during the rulemaking process that are held by the agency. All right, so let's talk about it. This is just a basic strategy for doing this kind of tracing work in regulations. We're going to start with a citation to the regulation in the CFR, because that's typically the questions that we get at the desk. Someone has a citation to the CFR, and they're trying to figure out why the language looks like that. We even have a citation that we have been given in our in-class exercise. So your reminder email today should have had an in-class exercise in it within the email. If you can reference that, I'm also going to say it out loud. We're going to be referring to Title 29 CFR Section 1630.1. If you don't know what any of that means, don't worry. We're going to talk about citation in a moment. We're going to take that section in the CFR, and then we're going to look to explanatory notes to determine further information about that section in the CFR. First, we're going to look to the authority note. The authority note gives us information about what statutory provision has granted the authority to the agency to create this regulation. Next, we're going to look to source notes. Source notes is going to give us information about the final rules that created and then amended the CFR section of interest. All right, and that's actually going to point us back to the Federal Register. All right, and then we're going to look up the final rule and the proposed rule in the Federal Register to find additional identifying numbers, and those identifying numbers are going to help us find docket information. All right, so let's get started with that. I know all of this is complicated. Again, if you have questions as we go through this process, please feel free to use the chat box. And again, if you don't have the chat box open, it looks like a cartoon talk bubble when you hover over my slides. All right, so I've actually flipped my chart here because we're going to start at the end and move backward. So we're starting at changes made by the final rule are incorporated into the Code of Federal Regulations. So let's talk about the structure of the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR. The CFR is organized by subject matter, and it's very hierarchical in structure. So it's first divided into 50 titles based on large general subject areas like energy, agriculture, labor, etc. And then each title is further subdivided. First, you're going to be subdivided into chapters. They're typically named after the administrative body promulgating these regulations, like the EPA or the Department of Labor, etc. Then the chapters are divided into parts, and sometimes even further into subparts, based on more specific subject areas. Then the parts and subparts are divided even further to a section. Sometimes the section is called the basic unit of the CFR. It's kind of like the atom of the CFR. And I like to think of the CFR as kind of an idea funnel. So you start with huge, big picture ideas at the top, and then as you go through these subdivisions, you kind of narrow through chapters, parts, and then finally all the way down to your section. So this is what you're going to see when you see a citation to something in the CFR. First, you're going to see the title number, and this is actually the in-class example that I sent you in your reminder email. So first you're going to see the title number. So that's that big picture idea. I'm going to give you a spoiler alert. Title 29 is labor, so our example is going to be something labor and employment related. After CFR, which stands for Code of Federal Regulations, and there are dots in between each of the letters. You're going to see kind of a squiggly symbol that stands for section. After the section symbol, you're going to see a number and then a period and then another number. All right? The entire thing, both numbers with the period included, are your section number. The section number, the first number within your section number, so the number before the period, is going to be your part number. All right, so we know we're going to be looking at Title 29 of the CFR. We're going to then narrow further to Part 1630, and then we're going to narrow even further into Section 1630.1, and we're looking at the 2019 version of the Code of Federal Regulations. All right. So let's talk about the publication of regulations because they're a little different than what you might possibly expect. The CFR is actually published cyclically throughout the year, and they break it down into 4 parts by title number. So each yearly update, it looks a little bit like this picture I've given you in the slide. It gets a different colored spine. So when you're in a library after COVID, you get to look at the bookcase and you can actually see which titles of the CFR have been updated by the color on the spine. I've heard that 2020 is hot pink. I haven't seen it yet, but you can look and see everything that's hot pink has been updated. Everything that's brown hasn't yet been updated. All right, so now that we know what we're looking for, we need to figure out how to actually find it. So I've given you some free resources and subscription resources here. You can find almost all the editions of the CFR online for free. The Government Publishing Office has PDFs of all the print copies of the CFR from 1996 to the present. And I've given you the links on the GPO GovInfo website. And then from 1995 backward to the first printing of the CFR in 1938, you can look to the Law Library of Congress's CFR page. Of course, I have to note here, we're still migrating some of our digital copies. So the 70s and 80s don't have a lot of coverage, but everything else should be available there on the Law Library of Congress page. If you have access to subscription resources, please feel free to use them. I'm not going to go in depth on them today, but if you already have access to that through your job, please, or your academic library, please feel free to use them. All right, so let's look at that Government Publishing Office GovInfo website. Here you see several options to get your CFR section of interest. You can browse by category. So you could actually browse by regulatory information and then go to the CFR. You could also browse by, you could also search by citation. So if you already have your title and section number, you could do that. Or you could search by the advanced search. So let me go into this a little bit more in depth. Here's what the browse by category page looks like. You'll see at the bottom there's an option for regulatory information. And then there's an option to choose Code of Federal Regulations from your regulatory information list. Also, you could use the advanced search. Now, I strongly suggest if you have to do a keyword search, so you don't have a citation, you don't know what title your section of interest is in, please use the advanced search, not the global search box on the home page. Because the advanced search will allow you to narrow down to just the Code of Federal Regulations. It will also allow you to narrow down to a date range. So if you're looking for the most current version, you could say, I only want things published from 2019 to the present. All right? And that's going to spare you from getting thousands of search results, because if you search everything in GovInfo, I promise you, you will get thousands of search results. In our case, though, we are lucky enough to have been given a citation, so we can use the citation feature on GovInfo. So you'll see here, you have the option of putting in a title number and then a part number and then the section number they're referring to here is the number after the period in the section number. I would strongly suggest trying for just putting the part in, because then you can download the entire part and kind of search from there. But you're also welcome to just go directly to your section. And I've just shown you, this is the example for our in-class exercise. We're dealing with Title 29. The part is 1630, and the whole section number is 1630.1, so I've just put 1 in the section number box there. I see a question about updating, and we will talk about that in just a moment, so hang on with me. First, I want to show you what the section looks like that we're talking about. So I've done a little cutting and pasting together, but this is generally what your CFR section is going to look like. I want you to note that a part will generally have, if it's big enough, a table of contents that gives you the section numbers and the section titles. So sometimes you can use that table of contents for at-a-glance information about what topics are being addressed in this part. All right, so we're here. This is Title 29, and then Part 1630, and then all the sections within Part 1630. So let's break down. Before we break down, I first want to also show you, this is the Law Library of Congress page, so you get an idea of what that looks like. You can do a global keyword search, and you can narrow by date as well. Okay, so updating, I've promised, and here we are. Okay, so I'm going to address something, the way to update kind of officially. So if you're going into court, or if you're writing a report, or let's say you're turning in an assignment for a class, you're going to want to update your section of the CFR officially. To do that, what you would do is download that page that I just showed you. Let me go back. Of the CFR with the language from your section. You'd take note of when it was last updated. If it wasn't updated in the last month, so if it wasn't published in the last month, which it probably isn't because we have that cyclical publication schedule, you're going to want to look to a publication called the List of CFR Sections Affected. So what does this mean? The LSA is a cumulative list put out monthly that contains information about all the proposed, new, and amended federal regulations that have been published in the Federal Register since the most recent revision date of your CFR title. So we're dealing with Title 29. Assuming Title 29 hasn't yet been published in 2020, even though it's supposed to have been, but we're a little behind because of COVID. If we hadn't yet been published in 2020, we would go to the LSA, we would open the most recent month within the LSA, and then we would look for our section number, our title and section number within the LSA. So let me show you what that would look like. Here are some sample LSA pages. Now, sorry, I took these screenshots a little bit ago, so it's May instead of June. But let's just go with it as if this is the most recent edition. So I would look to the page that has Title 29, Labor, because that's the title that we're involved with. And then I would look for my section. My section is 1630.1. It might be, the type might be a little small here, so I'll just give you a spoiler notice. 1630.1 is not listed. If you look to, and I'm going to, let me see if I can circle it and make it a little bit clearer here. But if you look here, that is parts 1600 to 1699. 1630 is not listed, and that is actually a good thing. If our section is not listed, that means it hasn't been amended since the last publication of the CFR. So we can actually use that latest printed edition of the CFR without worrying that there have been updates made since it was published. So even if we're looking at an edition that hasn't been updated yet for 2020, if it's not listed here in the LSA, since the LSA is cumulative, that means that we don't have to worry about any changes made. No changes have been made since that publication. All right. Hold on just one second. So let me get you to the unofficial version of updating. So if you don't have to go into court or you don't have a report and you just want to see what the language looks like right now, you can use this resource called eCFR. eCFR is also printed on that GovInfo page that we talked about earlier. And eCFR is the most current version you're going to find in a governmental resource. So it is, and as you can see here, I did this at the beginning of the week, and it was already updated to July 10th. I think now it's updated to the 14th, so it's usually about 2 days behind, and it has the most recent updates to the CFR, and they're already included. So what I would suggest you do if you don't have to cite the LSA when you're doing kind of your research, you can use the eCFR to get the most up-to-date version of the CFR without having to worry as much about any updates being made in the meantime. The eCFR, even though it's unofficial, I'm putting in quotation marks, you can't see my quotation mark fingers, I still consider it very trustworthy. You should consider it very trustworthy. It's just if you go into court and you cite to the eCFR, they're probably not going to look at that as kindly. All right. So now that we know the language of our section of interest has not changed since the latest printing of the CFR, we can turn back to our CFR print pages to do more research. So we get asked a lot at the reference desk about why an agency is allowed to promulgate a regulation. To find the specific statute that, from Congress that authorizes an agency to promulgate a regulation, you would look to the authority note, which would be at the beginning of the section or part of the CFR. So here, with our example, section 16 or part 1630, at the end of the table of contents, you have, sorry, my circles are terrible, you have the authority note. And the authority note says to look to Title 42 of the U.S. Code, Section 12116 and 12205A, I believe. Sorry, the print is even small for me. And you can find where Congress has given them the authority to make these regulations. Another thing to note at the end of the table of contents, at the end of each part, is something called a source note. So you can see here, right under our authority note that we just talked about, there is a source note. The source note gives us information about where to find the final rules that have made up this regulation. So I'm going to talk about, let me actually talk about that. There is usually a source note at the beginning, at the end of the table of contents for a part. You should also look to the end of your section. Why would there be more than one source note? Because an agency might have created an entire part of a title of the CFR with a final rule, which is what you're seeing here at the end of the table of contents. But then they might have gone on to further amend some of the language in special sections of that part. And if they do later amend the wording of a section, you're also going to have a source note at the end of the language of that section. So this is an example of that. Here we have a note at the end of the table of contents in the part. And then we also have a citation at the end of the language for our section of interest. So 1630.1 was later amended in 2011. All right. So the citations that were given here in the source notes point to final rules. So if we wanted to see all of the docket information for both the original final rule that gave rise to this part in the CFR, we would look to this first source note at the end of the table of contents. And then if we wanted to find information about what happened with the promulgation of this final rule that amended the language, we'd go to this page in the Federal Register to find the final rule that amended this language. Okay, so now that we've been given the citations to the Federal Register that have the final rules, let's actually figure out how to find those final rules. So again, we're going backward in time. So we've talked about the Code of Federal Regulations. Now we're going back to the publication of the final rule. The publication of the final rule is going to have information about the agency reaction to public comments. So we're going to talk about how to find that as well. The Federal Register, as I said, is a chronological collection of the actions of executive branch agencies, commissions, etc. Each print copy is going to have the date of publication, and we'll just give you literally a listing of the final rules, proposed rules, notices, etc. that are included in just that day's issue. So let's see what a citation looks like. If someone's using proper legal citation, it should look something like this. You'll first have the name or the title of the regulation, and then after that you'll have a comma, and then instead of a title number and a section number, you're going to have a volume number and a page number. Now remember, that's because we're dealing with something that's chronologically published instead of being arranged by subject. So a title and section wouldn't give us any information. What we need instead is the volume that we pick up off the shelf, and then what pages we turn to find this final rule. All right, so volume number, page numbers. You'll sometimes get two page numbers, and typically you'll get the first page on which the final rule appears, and then you'll get a comma and a page number on which your section of interest appears in the Federal Register. Next, you'll get in a parenthetical the date of the issue. So this was published on March 25th, 2011. And then, if you're lucky, you'll get a parenthetical describing what section of the CFR is being affected or amended. All right. So this is our amendment that we found in the source note at the end of our CFR section. So it's great. It's giving us information about what's being amended. Section 1630.1 of Title 29 is being amended. All right, I want to talk about where we can find these online. The good news is that you can find all copies of the Federal Register online for free. The Federal Register began being printed in 1936. So from 1936 to the present, you're going to be able to go to GovInfo. GovInfo has now all of those copies. Before, literally months ago, the Law Library of Congress was the only place to find some of those older ones. So you can either go to the Law Library of Congress page or the GovInfo page for Federal Register copies. I'm going to talk more in depth about those two items you see in the middle, federalregister.gov and regulations.gov. I want to talk a little bit right now about why I have both of them listed here. Federalregister.gov is a really helpful page if you already have a citation to the Federal Register, particularly for issues published from 1994 to the present, because you can enter the citation you've been given and then be taken directly to the rules page. And you can download a PDF copy of exactly what that page looked like in the printed copy of the Federal Register. We're going to look at that in just a moment, but I just want you to know federalregister.gov is extremely helpful if you just want to put in your citation, get taken straight to that page in the Federal Register. Regulations.gov doesn't have that search by citation ability, at least not as fully as federalregister.gov does. But what I like about regulations.gov is that it's extremely helpful for finding agency docket information. So again, when we take a step backward, go to the agency docket, you're going to find a lot of agency docket information on regulations.gov for free. So keep that in mind. Federalregister.gov is great for citation input. Regulations.gov is great for finding docket information and for submitting your own comments if you want to. If you wanted to submit a comment and the comment period is still open on a proposed regulation, that is where you can put your comment on that proposed rule. All right, so let's talk about federalregister.gov. This website offers PDF copies of the Federal Register from 1994 to the present, and it also enhances that material by allowing you to search by citation, search by subject, search by agency, and search by keyword. You can also set up email alerts on your searches, as long as you're willing to give your name and your email address, and then they can email you if something changes either on a specific regulation or generally on a topic area. So this is what federalregister.gov looks like. I've put boxes here so you can see there's a couple different ways to search. You can search by the global search box in the middle of the screen or by the search box at the top of the screen. If you get confused while on the site, so if you suddenly have a blank about how to do searching in this page, there is something called reader aids that can really help you with kind of research guides about regulations. And I've directed people to that a couple times while they're trying to do their Federal Register research. I also want to show you the Browse by Topic page. So if you're interested on documents on a certain topic, so you can see there if you were interested on regulations about accountants, you could actually click on that and everything that's been coded to the accountant's topic area would then appear in a search results page, and then you could actually save that search result and get email alerts on it. This is what a search page looks like. So I've actually put in the citation to the Federal Register that is of interest. And you'll see here it says, it looks like you were searching for this citation. We found the document that contains that page number here. And our topic of interest is the Americans with Disabilities Act, particularly equal employment provisions. So that looks like it's given me the entire final rule that I was looking for before. Note on the side, you can also limit your search results if you want to by agency and by type of document. So if I were to open that final rule that it gave me the citation for, this is what the page would look like. Here you're going to see a ton of really helpful information. You'll see information about the agency that promulgated the rule, whether the document you're looking for is a notice, proposed rule, or final rule, a summary of the rule, the text of the rule, a link to the PDF copies of pages. So we'll actually link you to the PDFs of the pages as they would appear in the printed copy of the Federal Register, and citations to sections or parts of the CFR being changed. So you'll see down here, it's letting me know Title 29, Part 1630 is being changed by this final rule. Another thing that you'll see on that page are different types of numbers. So you'll likely see a document number, a regulation identifier number, or RIN, and a docket number. And each of these give you a little bit different information, but can all be very helpful in your research. So let's talk about it. The document number is a unique number assigned by the Office of the Federal Register to each document published in the Federal Register, whether a notice, proposed rule, or final rule. So if we were to actually go back to our page, we would see you probably can't see it because it's under your buttons there, but the document number is 2011-6056. Next, you're going to see the RIN. RINs are unique 8-digit codes made up of two 4-character groups separated by a dash. So in our case, let me see if I can go back. In our case, the RIN is 3046-AA85. So that's 4 letters, numbers, dash 4 more letters and numbers. The first 4 digits represent an agency code, and then the last 4 digits or characters represent a unique code for that regulatory process. So everything from the notice of proposed rulemaking, the any notice to extend the comment period, the final rule, any of that information will all be put under that one RIN. The RIN is assigned by the Regulatory Information Service Center of the General Services Administration, so that's done by a separate agency or administration. But instead, if you also see a docket numbers are actually put together by the agency. All right, so docket numbers are agency created. Regulation identifier numbers are GSA, RISC related. Okay, I know that can be confusing. I just want you to know. So RIN, 4 numbers or digits or letters, then a dash, and then 4 more characters. Docket number isn't going to follow those same kind of rules because it's done by the agency. It's important, but it will link all the documents created under a certain regulatory process in one place for that agency. So what I suggest is write down both the RIN and the docket number. So in case you have to talk to anyone at the agency about a certain regulatory process, you'll have both at hand in case they use one over the other. Oh, I got a question about when I say regulation, do I mean part or section? In this case, I'm talking about part because as you saw on the federalregister.gov page, this regulatory process affected 29 CFR Part 1630. It kind of depends on what the final rule is affecting. So if it's only affecting a section of the CFR, then everything's going to be classed as it affects that section. In this case, we're dealing with a part. So it would be everything affecting this regulatory process. This regulatory process is amending or creating Part 1630 of Title 29 of the CFR. I know, it's a lot of steps. Let me talk about how you can find this information if you're looking at the actual print copy of the Federal Register. I know it's tiny and in 3 columns, which is very confusing, but stick with me. This is what it's going to look like if you actually picked up the print copy of the Federal Register. And I've actually turned to the first page of the final rule that we were looking for. So the final rule that affected Section 1630.1 of Title 29 of the CFR. All right. So first, you're going to see information about the agency that promulgated this rule. You're going to see information about the part or sections that are being amended or created by this final rule. So Part 1630. Next, you're going to see the RIN, if it's for a rulemaking process from 2000 to the present. RINs weren't in existence until about 2000. So if you're dealing with something that's a little older, you might not see the RIN. But we are dealing with something a little later. We're dealing with something from 2011, so we do see an RIN. The title, the action, so what kind of document is this? Is it a final rule, proposed rule, or notice? If this is a final rule, a quick summary, the effective dates of this final rule, and then I want to note contact information. So the agency will give you a contact person. That contact person, now this is from 2011, that contact person might not still be there, but you have a phone number that you can call and you have the person's title. So if that person is, if Christopher is no longer there, you can ask for whoever took over Christopher's rulemaking processes. All right. Okay. I'm going to go further down, and then you're going to see information about the notice of proposed rulemaking. So we're looking at a final rule. It's giving me a summary of kind of how we got here. So it's giving me information about the authority legislation that was passed by Congress that authorized this rulemaking process. And then it's also going to give me information about the notice of proposed rulemaking that led to this final rule. All right. It's also going to give me a citation to where I can find that notice of proposed rulemaking in another page of the Federal Register. All right. So in our case here, you're going to see it gives us notice of proposed rulemaking down here. All right. I'm going to go one page further, so I'm just turning the page in the Federal Register. And then you're going to see, after that summary that we talked about, you're going to see summary and response to comments. That's where they have to address the comments that they received from the public. And again, they might group comments that all had kind of the same general idea in one place, but at least they're addressing it here. And then after they address those comments, they're going to give you, in this box here, the docket number. So the docket number for our case, or our regulation, is EEOC-2009-0012. So that's the number the EEOC has given this rulemaking process. All of this information that's given to you before we even get to the text of the final rule is called the preamble. That's why you see this word preamble at the top. So none of this is the final rule. Like, it's included in the text before the final rule itself, but the language of the final rule is going to follow this preamble information. Okay, so we've gotten from CFR back to the final rule. Now we have to go even further back to the notice of proposed rulemaking and use that information also to find docket information. Now we got the docket number in the final rule. That docket number is also going to be recreated in the notice of proposed rulemaking as well. So reminder, docket number created by the agency, and it links the docket information, the notice of proposed rulemaking, and the final rule all in one place. To do that, to find that docket information, I'm going to go to regulations.gov. Because remember, regulations.gov has a lot of that docket information freely available for download for the public. And as you see here, I've starred docket materials. This is also where you can make your own comments as long as the comment period is still open. Now, I have to note that not every agency participates in regulations.gov. There's a link there where you can see which agencies don't. It's not a long list. And largely, it falls under those agencies and groups that have that national security aspect to them, where they don't necessarily have to go through the notice and comment rulemaking process. That's a lot, or they're a very small agency or group that just doesn't have the wherewithal to keep up with regulations.gov. You can see the list there. Most agencies, sub-agencies, commissions, et cetera, will be on regulations.gov. Here's what the home page looks like. You can do an advanced search. You'll notice there's an advanced search linked here. You can also do a global search here. You can also browse as well. There's a browse option at the top of your screen. I would suggest when you're doing a search in regulations.gov, not to use your Federal Register citation, but to use your RIN or your docket citation, because those numbers are going to get you to the information you're looking for more quickly. Here's what it looks like if I searched based on my RIN, I open the proposed rule. So this is the NPRM, or Notice of Proposed Rulemaking, or Proposed Rule. All of those equate to one another. You'll see here it's given me a link to open the docket folder. All right, let's look at the docket folder. You'll see here this docket folder has proposed rule, any notices that were put out in between the proposed rule and the final rule, and other supporting documents. So in our case, they actually held town hall meetings on this proposed rule. So you get the transcripts here of those town hall meetings. Also, down at the bottom, you'll see you get digitized comments. So these are the comments that were submitted. The comments that were submitted by mail rather than on regulations.gov have been scanned and put into regulations.gov. And one thing I want to note from here is that the comments are searchable by keyword. So if you were interested in a particular phrase or a particular keyword and you just wanted to see who submitted comments on that phrase or on that keyword, you could search the comments here on regulations.gov to find that information. All you'd have to do is click View All, which is right next to the comments, and then there's a search box that pops up. Whew, okay. I know we only have 5 minutes, so I'm gonna wrap it up. If you forget everything we talked about here today, I know it's a ton of information for a 1-hour class. I'm giving you here some internet resources that you can use. We also are going to make the slides available. What I would do is, if you want the slides, let me actually share the slides with you in just a moment. And also, if you can't get the slides during this class period, you can also send us a request via our Ask a Librarian service, which is on our homepage. Our homepage is law.gov. You'll see a button at the top of the screen for Ask a Librarian. These are just some really great internet resources. And I'm also giving you the Ask a Librarian form here. What I'm going to do is use the transfer feature in WebEx to try and give you the slides. Let me see. And if you have any trouble downloading the slides this way, just send us an Ask a Librarian, and we will send you the slides via email. But let me give you, here is a PDF copy of the slides. You should be able to see that in the middle of your screen. And if you want to download it, you click on it and then click download, and it should download for you. If it isn't downloading for you, you're having technical issues, please feel free to send us an Ask a Librarian request. I think I can move the file transfer box so it's a little bit easier to see. All right. So I know I've only given us 4 minutes, but I'm going to go through our questions here and see if I can't answer some of your questions while people are downloading the file. If I go quiet, that's what I'm doing. I also want you to know we do have a survey. So when you leave, you should have a survey pop up for you. And if you submit that survey, I would really appreciate it. I actually do read the surveys and try to adjust the class as necessary. Let me see. Oh, I got a question. Are all regulations assigned in RIN? Well, it looks like Elizabeth might have already contacted you. It depends on if the regulation is published from 2000 to the present. If you're dealing with stuff pre-2000, you're not going to find an RIN attached to a rulemaking process. Sorry about that. But the docket number should still be there, and you should be able to search for things using that docket number. I'm still looking at your questions. Let me see, because I've answered a couple of these during the class. Is there a general time by which the CFR is updated on GovInfo? For instance, when will the CFR on GovInfo reflect the changes made on July 1st? That is a great question. Generally, GovInfo is pretty quick to upload once the print copy has been prepared and released. Uh, right now, with everything that's happening, they are a little behind. So I'm not expecting the July one to be up yet. To be honest with you, the batch that's supposed to be released in July, I'm not expecting that to be up yet. What I would do in the meantime is use that ECFR, and you can actually kind of compare and contrast the language in the ECFR with the language in your GovInfo official copy of the CFR. Also, at the end of the ECFR version of the section that you're looking for, you're going to see those source notes. So if the source note hasn't changed in the ECFR version, that means no changes have been made up until that date. So if you're looking at the ECFR and it's been updated through yesterday, let's say, and the source note in your section of the CFR that you're looking up in ECFR has not changed, so it hasn't been updated for something that happened in 2019 or 2020, that means your language hasn't changed either. So you don't have to worry about changes being made in the meantime. And I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Largely, the advice is until that new batch comes out in July, the July batch comes out on GovInfo, you can use ECFR as kind of a backup to see what the language looks like right now. All right. Um, if you have additional questions, I know I haven't given you a heck of a lot of time. If you have any additional questions I haven't answered, or if you weren't able to download the file, please feel free to either ask us a question via Ask a Librarian or send us a request for the slides via Ask a Librarian. We're happy to get back to you that way. I've given you the link here in the middle of the screen with your slides. Also, you can go to law.gov, law.gov, which is our homepage. And at the top of your screen, you're also going to see a link to Ask a Librarian. All right, just going through. Is there a way to track a rule after you have made a comment? What I would do is go to regulations.gov and try to set up an account with regulations.gov to track it that way. Federal Register and regulations.gov should allow you to set up an account and do some tracking in that way. I would also consider having a search based on your RIN or your docket number and saving the search that way if you're having any trouble following a specific regulatory process. So because everything's going to be linked to that RIN or that docket number. I've run out of time. I see there are a couple questions I haven't gotten to. If I haven't gotten to your question, please feel free to submit it via Ask a Librarian. I'm also going to stop the file transfer. If you haven't gotten the slides, please feel free to use Ask a Librarian to get those slides. And also, please submit the survey. That I would really appreciate that. And I want to thank you guys for attending. I know it's a lot of really dense information. We tried to make it a little easier for you, but I appreciate you coming, and I would really appreciate if you did the survey. All right, thank you guys so much. I'm going to log off now. Please feel free to attend some of our other events. I've given you the link there as well. Thank you.